Yo, what's going on, fam? It's Tahir Johnson, and we're back with another episode of the Cannabis Diversity Report. Today, this is super dope. I have my good friend Shaleen Title in the house. Somebody that is super experienced in cannabis, has done so much from being a regulator to an advocate, and really a long time, somebody that I've looked up to in the cannabis industry. So it's great to have you here. How you doing, Shaleen?
I'm doing great. I'm feeling great. Thanks so much for having me on to here. I'm a big fan of the show.
Thank you. Well, how you been feeling? It must be good, a little bit relieved to not have you to wear the regulator hat anymore.
It's so good. It's like, I guess 7 months now, and I'm feeling so liberated and empowered and like just being able to do whatever I want. Like I never knew how much I appreciated that until I didn't have it and then had it back.
I hear you, but you're still staying busy, right? You're I know you just did the CEO now of the Parabola Center.
Yeah.
Also, I know you have your fellowship now. So talk, what are you up to nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, all like the hats that I wear are trying to take the lessons that I learned as a regulator and share them as broadly as possible and as quickly as possible. So I have a fellowship through the end of the summer with the Ohio State University Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, putting together some of those resources, especially practical tools for my fellow regulators and the new ones to come. And then started this new policy project called the Parabola Center. And then I'm also a vice chair of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, which 10 of us across the country got together so that we could collaborate and also be like a welcoming space for the new regulators of color as they come on.
Yes, and I think that's so important, and I love to see that all of you have come together because, for one, the experience and insight that you have as people of color and what you bring to the industry is very important. And it's also super dope to think about how all of y'all came together. Like some of y'all came together on that webinar. So I feel like I'm a piece of the history. So that's pretty cool.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing us together and even giving us the idea.
Yeah. And so, Shaleen, for people out there that may not know you, talk a little bit about how did you get into the cannabis industry? What attracted it to you? Because you were actually an attorney, right?
Well, it was way before I was an attorney. Actually, there wasn't an industry to be attracted to. This was like 20 years ago. It was a movement. It was a pure movement. And I would say I have this like unshakable optimism. Sometimes people even ask me like, how are you so optimistic all the time? And it's because when I joined like 20 years ago, no one thought that we were going to be able to legalize marijuana. There was no money in it. And it was a movement really led by a lot of young people, a lot of patients, a lot of people who just really, if you were in it, it was because you believed in it. And no one thought that the movement was going to be able to do it. And I joined at a really opportune time because, we had 50 years of activists fighting for this. And it was just the right time when I joined about 20 years ago as a student. And of course, we've been making really dramatic progress since then.
Right. And so you were also one of the founding board members of the Minority Cannabis Business Association also, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Students for Sensible Drug Policy as well. I was a trustee. It was really cool. It's been so cool to watch the way that MCBA has evolved and how they've stayed on the cutting edge. I worked on the model state bill. A lot of it was adopted in different places. And now there's the model ordinance, which is really important. And I know they're doing a lot of great work.
Absolutely. And so, like you said, having taken that experience and from, working on things like the model ordinance, but really actually having been a regulator, right? That's something that a lot of people haven't had the experience of doing. And I know everybody has these ideas of like what they want, things to be like, but I'm sure it was a super difficult job to do, like actually in practice. And I know I've seen you fight some battles out there too. So like, what was that experience like, just being a regulator, and what did you really learn from it?
I think the biggest thing that I learned or that was reinforced is you have to just find the power where you can and take it where you can, especially this being the diversity report, when you're a person of color, and it's not necessarily handed to you the way that it is to say other demographics. That's like a lifelong lesson. And for me, there was a big turning point. So we started in 2017, and I think our first, not a lot of people know this, the first draft of our regulations were actually great and sensible. And one of the parts that I led on was on social consumption. And this draft should like go in a museum somewhere because it was so sensible. It basically said a movie theater, an art gallery, massage studio, any place where consumers would typically use cannabis could incorporate it into the business. And you hear that now and you're like, okay, that, we're years away from that point. But we passed it because it was sensible. And then there was this massive backlash against the commission. Like, what on earth are you doing, from law enforcement and high level government officials? And I kind of had to make a decision at that point because I was one of 5 votes and I was not going to have that influence again with just my vote. So then it became, how do I use this platform? How am I very creative with this one of 5 votes that I have? How do I collaborate where I am in agreement with other commissioners? And I think that's a lesson that all of us can take no matter what your role is. If you're part of a big company, and you're one of the people who's pushing for that company to do better, you're really important. If you're the only person of color, in a room that's making decisions and you need to push certain things, you just have to find your power where it is, and it may not look obvious.
Right, absolutely. And some of the things that you actually Massachusetts in itself, Massachusetts was the first market to have a statewide social equity program, right? So what was it like getting that executed, and what were some of the like social equity and of course economic empowerment things that you felt it was important to have in there?
Yeah, so as a regulator, as a group, we had control over essentially business licensing, as it was under the statute. But then, you really are not going to be successful unless you have all of these other pieces that are not necessarily under your control, like local decisions, like capital, and it's great to see that newer states now have, state funds for capital, but we didn't have that as the first. And so I think it's really important as a regulator to not just be like, okay, we're supposed to write these regulations, let's write them, but really thinking about the big picture. And so we learned things like if you provide guidance to local officials or you help out local activists who are trying to convince their local officials, and they're on the ground and they're having to compete, with all of these NIMBY people who don't want to see dispensaries, we can help them, we can signal, we can give them guidance. And then with capital, we don't directly control capital in Massachusetts. I hope we do eventually, and catch up with the other states. But we can do things like with delivery, offer a 3-year exclusivity period so that if someone wants to invest in delivery early, which is certainly a smart, financial investment, they have to do it with a social equity or an economic empowerment applicant.
Right. Well, I think the fact that you were able to get that delivery license set aside for those economic empowerment applicants, I think that was amazing. That was definitely great to see. So from what you said, like when you think of all these new states now, like New Jersey, New York, Virginia, Connecticut, they all social equity was a big part of what the whole program is based on. What should they keep in mind, like the people that are now going to be tasked with trying to implement all of this? What do you think they should keep in mind? What's most important from your experience?
Yeah, and just answering that question is like the most important thing I think I can do with my time. So, hopefully this resource that we're creating with this fellowship is going to answer a lot of those questions in the most practical, not academic way. I mean, evidence-based, but really practical, because we need that handbook up there. But I'll highlight a couple of the things that I think are maybe not so obvious and really important. And one of them is the timing. I think every jurisdiction that has tried to implement an equity program, that has tried to do it different ways, has had a common experience where even the most, the regulator with the most expertise and the best ideas and the most political support, they're going to struggle with getting an equity program off the ground, writing the paper and then getting it off the paper and getting it done in real life. And while that is happening, you have to be aware that other groups who can get started immediately are going to take up a big amount of the market share, and they're going to do it early, and that's going to have an impact. And it's going to have a very real life impact in the way that consumers act and in the way that the market unfolds. And so I think taking that timing into consideration and perhaps tying things together to equalize it is a really important thing that regulators can do, and a lesson that, it doesn't necessarily have to do with what's in your regulations or the capital or the technical assistance that you provide, but in the big picture, it's going to account for some of the barriers that you probably can't even envision if you don't let the market move too fast until you solve some of these problems.
Mm-hmm. And that's such a good point. And I think also you've learned about this, just speaking about the market too fast, right? I think one of the challenges that you talked about the market too fast is the challenges of if we legalize federally too fast, right? Do you think that should we be looking to like legalize now, or what's your opinion on that federally?
So let's legalize now possession. Let's stop all of the consequences that people face for marijuana convictions. Let's free people from prison. Let's expunge records, resentencing. All of that needs to happen immediately. But what doesn't need to happen, and these things get conflated a lot, is opening up the markets completely, especially to interstate commerce. And that's not the most obvious thing, but if you have been paying attention in the States and you watched what happens, there's the potential entrepreneurs or the current entrepreneurs who watch your show will of course be very familiar with this, that once a market opens and there is a lot of uncertainty, especially when you're trying to get something at the local level, they haven't done it yet, you're trying to get something at the state level, they haven't done it yet, you're trying to get capital, you're trying to like navigate all of these pieces as they're being built, that chaos always hurts the smaller businesses with fewer resources. And we've learned that consistently time and time again. And so if we're going to, magnify that problem times a million, it doesn't matter, how much is in the trust fund or what we do, with equity programs at the federal level. No matter how good the program is, there will be this period of chaos, right? And it's very unlikely that it'll play out differently than in the States. And so what we need to do is just give ourselves some room. And I don't even have a strong opinion on how we do it. My project, the Parabola Center, put 2 different options on the table, and there's a ton of other options in between. But what we need to do is make sure that we try it, see how it works out, and then make a bigger decision so that in 5 years, we don't have a market that we don't like and there's nothing that we can do to fix it.
Right. And so like you said, you did do that paper offering, some amendments. And so talk about I guess for people that may not be familiar as policies, so we can educate people, talk about the MORE Act. What is it, what does it do? And what are some of the good things, like the pros and cons, I guess, of it? And then I guess some of the other additional recommendations that you made around it.
Yeah, so the MORE Act is a terrific bill. I'm on the record endorsing it since day one. The best thing about it is that it is comprehensive and its provisions have a strong focus on criminal justice and restorative justice and repairing the harms of the war on drugs. And there's a lot of different ways that it does that. It also fixes the barriers that small businesses face because of federal law. They can now access Small Business Administration resources if it passes. It'll fix the research issues. It'll deschedule cannabis and automatically just fix a lot of these problems. And then on top of it, it has many proactive measures to impact positively those communities that have been harmed, Black and Latino people in particular. All of that said, if you look at what has happened in the States, you see a pattern And that pattern is not addressed by either the MORE Act or the new Senate bill because, can you hear me okay? So what changes is that what we've learned in the States is that once you open up the market, we're likely to see this pattern that I've described. And so I think it's really important that any federal bill, be it MORE Act or the Senate bill or whatever ends up being introduced in the future, takes that into account, particularly the timing that I've mentioned. And it also needs to, because the federal government can do this, right? People forget the federal government has the power to incentivize states to go in a certain direction. And that's one of the things that we modeled in our Parabola Center project is you could allow states to opt out of the Controlled Substances Act if they take certain actions. And we went off the Cole memo. The Cole memo is a list of basically things that states need to do in order to have more protection. And it's things like prevent diversion to children, make sure you're not encouraging parts of the illicit market. And we added another very obvious thing, which is to make sure that you are considering equity in your state law. And so the federal government under this plan would ensure that if a state is successfully opting out, they would be doing all of those things, including the equity. And then the other model was to actually create a new agency that would regulate cannabis. Because if you're going to do this right, the way that we're talking about with these big goals, and again, state experience really comes in handy, right? If you are talking about building an industry that looks different, then you need to regulate it differently. And with alcohol and with tobacco, there's a lot of relevant experience, but we've never built a law with this kind of goal to repair damage. And so you just need the time, you need the ability to develop the competence, you need the resources. And if you're taking on a huge undertaking that is only going to happen once, right? Like we're only going to legalize marijuana at the federal level once, and then it's going to be the status quo and hard to change forever, then let's make sure we give ourselves the time and the resources to do it right.
Right, absolutely. And you also mentioned the Senate bill, the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act. Have you had a chance to to go through that, and how is that different? What does it achieve differently than the MORE Act, and what's your early analysis of that one?
So yes, but more important, I just want to highlight the process is terrific. They are taking a really inclusive, open approach, and they did not introduce a bill yet. They put a draft out to the public, and they said, anybody who has feedback on this can email us by September 1st, then we're going to redo it, and then we'll introduce a bill. And so it's really important that members of the public, if they have an opinion, they have to express it now by September 1st. This is their chance. And then, you can't complain later if you don't participate. So that said, it's very similar to the MORE Act. I think that it has the same issue that I mentioned, where I think it would open up the doors too fast, and we need something a little more gradual. But there are some great additions. It definitely takes regulation it's more intentional about regulation and assigning different agencies to regulate various products, and kind of, I think, understands the spectrum from medical products to, say, cosmetic products that have CBD, and kind of like the different regulations that you need. I think that's really good. I think we need to think about which agency is going to be doing the regulating. And then also there is so when the majority leader, Schumer, talked about the bill, he was very clear that he does not want to see big alcohol and big tobacco swoop in and take over the industry, which is, for me, probably the most important thing and the biggest difference about this bill. And so the bill has some regulations that are borrowed from alcohol that prevent corporate bribery, inducements, pay-to-play schemes, and these kind of limitations are largely credited for why, when you go to buy beer, you can buy beer that's made by a few huge manufacturers, or you can buy beer from a very small, craft company. There's a lot of room for that. And so I think that's a really good start, but I think it's also very ripe to be expanded based on the different lessons that we've learned in the state. But the fact that they have the right intentions in mind, they've started those processes in the bill, and then now they've made this inclusive, open request for feedback is really the right way to do it. I think the movement has the power, and now it's up to us to take advantage of it.
Right. And where do people go to be able to submit their comments?
So we've tweeted that from Parabola Center if you want to follow us. And I think there's a lot of, not everybody can do everything, so there's a lot of organizations that have expertise in different things. CHEM, I forgot what it stands for. Do you know what CHEM stands for?
Yes, it is. It is Cannabis Health Equity Movement.
Thank you. You passed the pop quiz. CHEM is who I look to for science and health expertise. I think Last Prisoner Project did a great analysis on the restorative justice pieces. And then Parabola Center is really focusing on that, making sure that we're not going to see excessive corporate dominance of the market by a few companies. And so I think if you follow all these different organizations, and I'm sure there's other great ones as well, you can come up with your own feedback. And then submit it by September 1st. There's an email address that they signed up. And if you like the Parabola Center model, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. And you can look at our website, parabolacenter.com. The experiment here, we haven't officially launched. Our official launch is in September. The experiment is to see if this can work on crowdfunding, on small donors. Because this think tank policy writing is where I've seen a gap a lot of times. Like the movement will be really successful in convincing policymakers that they need to prioritize, say, racial equity and social justice. But then policymakers don't have the time or even like the mental freedom, I think, to come up with really fresh ideas. This is what I learned when I was in government, is the environment that you're in really suppresses your ability to come up with new ideas, and it disincentivizes you to come up with original ideas because no one has the time to implement it. And so if you have policy experts who can just do that last bit of work, and I don't mean to minimize it because it took us months to write the MORE Act rewrite, but you have so much work that movements do to create that political will. And then you just need to get from, the bullet points or the recommendations or the ideas to the actual written policy. That's where Parabola Center fits in.
Right. And I think that's, like you said, I think that's a really important organization because, like you said, for regular people to be able to have access to a voice, is very important as we look at all the different type of legislation that's coming out. And a lot of that, and that's another thing that I think is always important to touch on too, thinking of the different ways that people of color can use their expertise, like to come into the industry. So like for you, like being an attorney, right? How has that helped you, and how do you think other people can use that profession to be able to look at the industry?
Yeah, I love that question because lawyers have particular expertise, entrepreneurs have particular expertise. We all have a role to play. And I love what you just said about, everyday people having a voice, because it was our movement that made all of this change happen. We should not be like just letting it go at this moment. And there are so many other nonprofits and groups that are making sure that the movement has a voice. DPA, Normal, SSDP, so many others, MPP. And so I feel like I'm in a chain, where we're kind of like all handing each other the torch for all these different areas. And for lawyers, yeah, you have so much power because it's just specialized expertise to actually write things into a law or analyze a law. And my advice would actually be, for me, the most helpful thing is giving myself space to even like visualize what I want and have an idea. And just because you're a lawyer doesn't mean that you need to have a fancy lifestyle. And it doesn't mean that you need to do work that you don't necessarily want or need to do just to be able to afford things that you don't want or need to do. I mean, that goes for everybody, but I think lawyers in particular, you can really make that decision often. And so when you give yourself that space to really think, and you're not just like working and surviving all the time nonstop, you can think about the moment that we're in, right? And like your great grandkids one day, you know, do you want them to be getting, you know, Philip Morris cannabis cigarettes delivered by Amazon and that's their only choice? Or do you want this like beautiful market that we can visualize with all of these small businesses and all of these craft products? And what are you doing to get to that point? Because like you can say that to anybody, right? It's like very generic, like, oh, let's see you make a difference. But if you are a cannabis attorney who is a person of color living in 2021, you know, before the first bill was introduced, like really give yourself the time to digest that and think about the power that you have.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, with that being said, with, you know, for you being a woman of color and actually having had the opportunity to like be so impactful and actually be a regulator, like, what does that mean for you? How does that even feel?
So in my early days, I was very often the only woman in the room or the only person of color in the room. And I had very little power, but I was always trying to use it, you know, and then when there was one more person, I can give you an example, actually. When we wrote the Massachusetts law, me and Chanel Lindsay were the only people in the room who were people of color. And we really used that and amplified each other and took advantage of the support to push the law as far as we possibly could. And I also had, you know, a lot of times when I was in the industry, when I had clients, and I think that, you know, now that I'm in a place where the most impactful I can be is not being at that table, but just creating my own table, is just continuing the same pattern. And I have the utmost respect for anybody who's in any situation where they're taking advantage of the power that they have to push for equity. And, you know, maybe one day you'll be in another role, you know, you'll grow out of the role that you're in. You're always going to be welcome at the table that I'm making, and you're going to be totally free to make your own. And I think that is a beautiful thing, because if there's one consistent thing that I've seen in the past 20 years, it's that there has been a solid progression towards racial equity and gender equity. And I have no question that's going to continue, cannabis or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, what for people that don't necessarily understand social equity or why it is so important, you know, can you share and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really broad topic, but in general, I would define it as it relates to cannabis. And you know, it's not something that cannabis invented. It's very widespread in public health, especially places. But as it relates to cannabis, we're creating these new laws from scratch to legalize cannabis after 50 or more years of using those specific laws to target Black and Latino people in particular, and that anybody who is targeted by those laws has had devastating effects upon themselves, their families, their communities. And so equity is taking that into account and taking efforts to restore it, to repair it. We'll never be able to repair it completely. And I think of it as three buckets. One bucket is making sure that we stop the harm and that we use criminal justice procedures to expunge records or try and restore the rights back to those people that they would have otherwise had. And then we have reinvestment of tax revenue, massive, massive windfall that comes with marijuana shouldn't be going anywhere except back to those communities that we used, you know, unlimited resources to target. And then third, the part that I had power over, which is the economic justice, the licensing, the jobs, and making sure that the massive economic revenue that's coming from this industry is being fairly directed to those same communities.
And from your experience, like again, looking back at Massachusetts, for people that are looking to put in laws in place in new states, is there anything that you say that you would do differently, or that was put in place that you know that they should not follow from the Massachusetts example?
I mean, I did everything I possibly could, so I'm not sure what I could have done differently, but I would say that there's a lot that states should not follow. because our law was not, a comprehensive way of addressing equity, and we didn't have the lessons in place. So I'll just repeat, because it is super, super important that for new states, you should really be thinking about tying the timing together so that making sure basically the market doesn't start, in short, until the equity businesses are ready to go.
That's it. I think that's really great, important insight. And Shaleen, where can people find and keep up with you in Parabola Center and make sure that they're tuned in to everything that you're doing?
So if you become a patron, if you go to patreon.com/Parabola Center, you can access all of our materials early and some videos that we do just for patrons. If you want to follow in general, I'm very active on Twitter and I get into a lot of policy conversations there. And then I would just encourage people from other organizations that want to team up or make sure that, I'm seeing your work and you're seeing my work. By all means, get in touch.
Absolutely. Well, I definitely appreciate you, coming through today. I think this is for something that a lot of people can really learn from your experience. I think it's so important that as we're building these new markets, people have the opportunity to hear from people that have actually done it. So I appreciate you coming through to share. Thanks
so much. I love that you started this show. It's really important, and I think it fills a necessary gap, and I appreciate you.
No, absolutely. Well, I appreciate it, y'all. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch up with y'all soon.